Why did Joe Biden win the presidency of America? Part 3. Biden hosted a 3-day U.S.-Africa summit in Washington in December 2022, attended by 49 African national leaders. The meeting was the first such summit since 2014. The leaders of every African nation in good standing with the African Union, except Eritrea, were invited to the summit. The leaders of African nations not in good standing with the O were also not invited. At the summit, Biden announced U.S. support for the O joining the G20 group of major economy, a long-sought goal for Africa. The summit was part of a broader effort by the U.S. to rebuild U.S.-African relations and counter Chinese influence on the continent. During the summit, the administration announced $800 million in new deals with Cisco Systems and Cybastion to combat cyber threats targeting Africa, a bid to blunt the dominance of the Chinese firm Huawei in Africa. The administration also signed a memorandum of understanding in support of the African Continental Free Trade Area to reduce trade barriers in Africa, and committed $55 billion to Africa over the next 3 years, focused on pre-existing U.S. initiatives such as the trade-focused Prosper Africa and Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, as well as the Power Africa initiative, which aims to increase connections of Africans to the electric grid. The administration also emphasized initiatives in technology and cybersecurity, health, clean energy and the environment, and other areas. Biden committed an additional $2 billion for emergency humanitarian aid and $11 billion for food security programs in Africa. The administration also expanded ties with West Africa, including support for infrastructure improvements at the Benin seaport of Cotonou, a key part of the West African economy. Biden appointed longtime U.S. diplomat Johnny Carson to coordinate implementation of U.S. actions following up from the summit. During the 2022 summit, Biden and senior administration officials also met privately with 6 African leaders facing elections in 2023, pushing them to ensure free and fair elections in their nations. Senator Bob Menendez, the Democratic chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, has criticized the Biden administration for hesitating to impose sanctions on the governments of Sudan and Ethiopia, where many atrocities and war crimes were committed in the Tigray War. On April 24, 2021, the Biden administration declared that the Turkish killings of Armenians at the start of the 20th century were a genocide. He is the first U.S. president to ever officially recognize the Armenian genocide. In July 2022, President Biden signed an executive order aimed at deterring the wrongful detention of Americans abroad. According to an estimate by the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation, there are at least 67 U.S. citizens who are currently imprisoned abroad. The foundation further estimates that 90% of those are wrongly detained by foreign governments hostile to the U.S., including Venezuela, Russia, China, Iran, and others. Dozens of families of Americans who are detained abroad say President Biden has failed to adequately address the crisis. They formed a group called Bring Our Families Home campaign to pressure Biden to do more. In March 2021, Biden held a virtual meeting with leaders of Japan, India, and Australia, an alliance of countries known as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or the Quad, that work together to address China's expansionism in the Indo-Pacific region. A few days later, the administration officials, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, met with U.S. allies in Asia and imposed sanctions on senior Chinese officials. Austin also visited India to deepen the defense ties between the two countries. In September 2021, Biden hosted the first in-person meeting of Quad at the White House. On May 23, 2022, Biden launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity to counter growing Chinese economic and political influence in the Indo-Pacific region. At the time of its launch, the IPEF had 12 partners including Australia, Brunei, India, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. In response, China described the proposed grouping as a closed and exclusive club. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan defended the IPEF by highlighting the diverse nature of the grouping's membership. In August 2022, the Biden administration announced that it will be hosting the White House Pacific Island Summit in September 2022, which will coincide with the week of the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly. On the day of Biden's inauguration, the Russian government urged the new U.S. administration to take a more constructive approach in talks over the extension of the 2010 New START Treaty, the sole remaining agreement limiting the number of U.S. and Russian long-range nuclear warheads. In Biden's first telephone call as president with Russian President Vladimir Putin on January 26, 2021, Biden and Putin agreed to extend the New START Treaty by an additional 5 years. Biden and his administration condemned human rights violations by the Russian authorities, calling for the release of detained dissident and anti-corruption activist Alexei Navalny, his wife, and the thousands of Russians who had demonstrated in his support. The U.S. called for the unconditional release of Navalny and the protesters and a credible investigation into Navalny's poisoning. On March 2, 2021, the U.S. and European Union imposed coordinated additional sanctions on Russian officials, as well as the FSB and GRU, over Navalny's poisoning and imprisonment. The State Department also expanded existing sanctions from the Chemical and Biological Weapons Control and Warfare Elimination Act that had been imposed after the poisoning of Skripal. The Biden administration is also planning to impose sanctions against Russia because of the 2020 SolarWinds cyber-espionage campaign, which compromised the computer systems of 9 federal agencies. Biden's national security advisor Jake Sullivan said the response will include a mix of tools seen and unseen, and it will not simply be sanctions. The Biden administration's comprehensive review into Russian activities has included an examination of reports that the Russian government offered bounties to kill U.S. troops in Afghanistan. The Biden administration said intelligence community has only low to moderate confidence in reports due to the fact that the bounty reports originated from detainee reporting and because of the difficult operating environment in Afghanistan. Biden called Russian President Vladimir Putin a killer in an ABC News interview and said that Russia would pay a price for election meddling. On May 19, 2021, the Biden administration lifted CAATSA sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project between Russia and Germany. Despite Biden's personal opposition to the project, the U.S. State Department says that it concluded that it was in the U.S. national interest to waive the sanctions. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov welcomed the move as a chance for a gradual transition toward the normalization of our bilateral ties. On June 16, 2021, Biden met with Putin in Geneva, Switzerland. The two presidents discussed a number of topics, including stable policy on climate change, nuclear proliferation, and cybersecurity. Russia's activities regarding Ukraine, Alexei Navalny, Belarus, and nationals jailed in each other's countries. The summit was significantly shorter than expected, only lasting 3.5 of the predicted 5 hours. Putin praised Biden as a knowledgeable and shrewd negotiator the next day. In November 2021, Putin stated that an expansion of NATO's presence in Ukraine, especially the deployment of any long-range missiles capable of striking Russian cities or missile defense systems similar to those in Romania and Poland, would be a red-line issue for Russia. In December 2021, Putin asked President Joe Biden for legal guarantees that NATO wouldn't expand eastward or put weapons systems that threaten us in close vicinity to Russian territory. The U.S. and NATO have rejected Putin's demands. On February 24, 2022, Biden condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, saying Putin chose this war and calling him the aggressor. He announced new sanctions against Russia. On February 25, the White House announced the U.S. would personally sanction Putin and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. On February 28, the Biden administration announced sanctions against Russia's central bank, prohibiting Americans from doing business with the bank and freezing the bank's assets. On March 29, 2022, Biden appeared to heighten his condemnation concerning Putin made at the end of his NATO trip to Europe, stating that he makes no apologies for previously stating that Putin cannot remain in power. On April 12, he called the war a genocide. Biden criticized the Kremlin for idle comments on the possible use of nuclear weapons. On April 28, Biden asked Congress for an additional $33 billion to assist Ukraine, including $20 billion to provide weapons to Ukraine. On May 10th, the House passed legislation that would provide $40 billion in new aid to Ukraine. The New York Times reported that the United States provided real-time battlefield targeting intelligence to Ukraine that helped Ukrainian forces kill Russian generals and sink the Russian warship Moskva. The Biden administration has pledged to help the International Criminal Court to prosecute Putin and others for war crimes committed during the invasion of Ukraine. The 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine instigated significant and substantial support to Ukraine during the Biden presidency, including 24 military aid packages to assist them against the invasion. On the 28th of October 2022, the Pentagon announced the 24th presidential drawdown of material worth $275 million. The security assistance has totaled $18.5 billion to Ukraine since January 2021. The aid includes 500 Excalibur precision-guided 155mm artillery rounds, 2,155mm remote anti-armor mine systems, more than 1,300 anti-armor weapons, more than 2.75 million rounds of small arms ammunition, more HIMARS rockets, 125 Humvees, and 4 satellite communications antennas for Ukraine's command and control systems, as well as training for operation of the NASAMS units. 2 NASAMS units arrived in Ukraine on the 7th of November 2022. President Biden promised to repair strained relationships with European allies in contrast to his predecessor Trump. An attack on one is an attack on all. That is our unshakable vow, Biden said, referring to Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. Biden pledged support for the European project and for Ukraine's sovereignty, as well as the need for global cooperation on fighting the pandemic and climate change. U.S. relations with France deteriorated in September 2021 due to fallout from the AUK-US Security Pact between the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, which aimed to counter Chinese power in the Indo-Pacific region. As part of the agreement, the U.S. agreed to provide nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. After entering into the agreement, the Australian government cancelled an agreement that it had made with France for the provision of French conventionally powered submarines. The deal angered the French government, which recalled its ambassador to the U.S., as well as the ambassador to Australia. Amid the diplomatic row, the French Foreign Ministry contended that it had been subjected to duplicity, disdain, and lies, and French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian called the deal a stab in the back. In a conciliatory call a few days later, Biden and French President Emmanuel Macron agreed to reduce bilateral tensions, and the White House acknowledged the crisis could have been averted if there had been open consultations between allies. A month later, Biden met Macron, telling him his administration was clumsy and that he was under the impression that France had been informed long before that France's deal with Australia was not going through. In February 2022, amid rising tensions between Ukraine and Russia, the Biden administration faced questions for its year-long failure to nominate an ambassador to Ukraine. The Biden administration has expressed interest in re-engaging with Iran on the Iran nuclear deal. Biden's predecessor, President Trump, withdrew from the deal in 2018, resulting in swift backlash from international community. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the U.S. would be interested in re-entering the agreement so long as Iran shows strict compliance. Blinken did not rule out a military intervention to stop Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. On February 25, 2021, President Biden ordered retaliatory airstrikes on buildings in Syria that the Department of Defense said were used by Iranian-backed militias to carry out rocket attacks on U.S. targets in Iraq. The operation was the first known use of military force by the Biden administration. The attacks prompted condemnation from many Democratic members of Congress. Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia questioned the administration's legal justification for acting without coming to Congress. Representative Ro Khanna claimed that the administration should have sought congressional authorization. In July 2022, Biden met with Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid to discuss the Iran nuclear deal and said that he continued to favor diplomacy. Lapid, however, expressed that only military threat would deter Iran from pursuing a nuclear program. On February 1, 2021, Biden condemned the Myanmar coup d'etat and called for the release of detained officials. Biden also left open the door to reimposing sanctions on the country, saying in a statement that the United States removed sanctions on Burma over the past decade based on progress toward democracy. The reversal of that progress will necessitate an immediate review of our sanction laws and authority, followed by appropriate action. On March 5, 2021, Biden imposed sanctions on Myanmar's Ministry of Home Affairs and Ministry of Defense and certain junta conglomerates. On March 22, 2021, Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced sanctions on several military generals in response to a violent crackdown on peaceful protests. Biden has reiterated his commitment to maintaining peace in Northern Ireland by resisting the possibility of a hard border as a result of Brexit. When asked by the Irish Times in March 2021 about comments made by Irish Foreign Minister Simon Coveney that the UK cannot be trusted on the Northern Ireland Protocol, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said that President Biden has been unequivocal about his support for the Good Friday Agreement. As part of his own Irish-American heritage, Psaki said that Biden has a special place in his heart for the Irish, underpinning his commitment to Northern Ireland's peace. Biden ordered a halt in the arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which the Trump administration had previously agreed to. 2 years after Jamal Khashoggi's assassination, Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence under Biden's administration, announced that the intelligence report into the case against the Saudi government would be declassified. It was reported that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman would be blamed for the murder, as was concluded by the CIA. On February 4, 2021, the Biden administration announced that the U.S. was ending its support for the Saudi-led bombing campaign in Yemen. President Biden, in his first visit to the State Department as president, said this war has to end and that the conflict has created a humanitarian and strategic catastrophe. However, the details of the end of American involvement in the war have yet to be released as of April 2021. In September 2021, Biden's national security advisor Jake Sullivan met in Saudi Arabia with Crown Prince bin Salman to discuss the high oil prices. The record-high energy prices were driven by a global surge in demand as the world quit the economic recession caused by COVID-19. The Biden administration was pressed on potential oil deals with Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and Iran that would have them increase their oil production. However, so far, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have declined requests from the U.S. As a presidential candidate, Joe Biden had vowed to make the Saudis pay the price and make them a pariah state, citing the kingdom's involvement in the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi. But in June 2022, the White House confirmed that Biden was to visit Saudi Arabia and meet Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman during his Middle East trip in July. The announcement came after inflation in the U.S. rose to a 40-year high. The Russian invasion of Ukraine also had an impact on the oil and gas prices in the U.S. Biden repeatedly appealed to the Saudis to increase oil production, but the kingdom turned down such requests. Biden's planned visit was seen as a move to seek Saudi assistance to ease the oil and gas prices at home. However, human rights activists and Democratic lawmakers warned Biden that the visit could send signals to Saudi that their horrific human rights violations could be exempted. Saudi dissidents living in the U.S. said that as Saudi activists who were wronged by Prince Mohammed, they feel betrayed by Biden. Son of Saud al-Jabri, Khalid al-Jabri said Biden's meeting with MBS would be equivalent of a presidential pardon for murder. Democratic Representative Adam Schiff also criticized the visit, saying, "I wouldn't go. I wouldn't shake his hand. This is someone who butchered an American resident, cut him up into pieces, and in the most terrible and premeditated way." On the 10th of July 2022, President Biden defended his trip to Saudi Arabia, saying human rights were on his agenda. In an op-ed, he wrote that he aims to reorient and not rupture relations with a country that's been a strategic partner for 80 years, and that Saudi Arabia has helped to restore unity among the 6 countries of Gulf Cooperation Council and has fully supported the truce in the context of the Yemen war. Ahead of Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia, reports revealed that the Biden administration could possibly lift a ban on sales of offensive weapons to Riyadh. However, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, they were focused on a real ceasefire and on Saudi efforts to end the war. Following the meeting with Saudi officials, Biden announced that the kingdom committed to extend the truce in Yemen. On the 2nd of August 2022, the State Department approved the potential sale of 300 MIM-104E guidance-enhanced missile tactical ballistic missiles for the Patriot missile defense system to Saudi Arabia. It also approved support equipment, spares, and technical support to the Arab nation. In addition, the State Department also approved the potential sale of 96 terminal high-altitude area defense missile defense system interceptors and support equipment to the UAE. However, Human Rights Watch said the U.S. should suspend sales of both offensive and defensive arms to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which have used American weapons in unlawful airstrikes. HRW said a policy reversal by the U.S. could lead to added rights violations in Yemen. The U.S. authorities indicted Thomas J. Barrack Jr., an outside advisor to Donald Trump during and after the 2016 United States presidential election campaign. They alleged he acted as an unregistered foreign lobbyist for the United Arab Emirates. Barrack was also accused of obstruction of justice by giving false statements to the investigators. He was found not guilty on all charges in November 2022. The DOJ also prosecuted some men for funneling more than $3.5 million to Hillary Clinton from George Nader, the royal advisor of the UAE. While federal prosecutors accused the Emirates of interfering in American politics from both sides, the relations with the Arab nation during Biden's presidency didn't witness much of the expected changes. The UAE was seen escaping its blunder-filled history of relations with the U.S., despite Biden's repetitive criticism against the Emirates' human rights violations and its attempts of infiltrating the U.S. politics. Moreover, the Biden administration also permitted the arms sales of $23 billion to the UAE, which was initiated by Donald Trump and involved a transfer of sophisticated weaponry like the F-35 fighter jets. The U.S. Justice Department did not charge any Emirati in the case. However, Barrack's indictment identified 3 UAE officials who were hosts at his reception in the Gulf nation after Trump's 2016 elections, and 2 others who were involved. Amongst the hosts was Abu Dhabi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, the UAE's National Security Advisor Tanan bin Zayed, and Director of the Emirati Intelligence Service, Ali Mohammed Hamad al-Shamsi. The 4th Emirati official was Abdullah Khalifa al-Ghafli, who tasked Barrack to push Emirati interests with America. Another official was Youssef al-Ataiba, who asked to remain anonymous in discussions over private matters. Early in the Biden administration, the White House confirmed that the U.S. Embassy would remain in Jerusalem, which would remain recognized as the capital. The administration also expressed support for the Abraham Accords while wanting to expand on them, although it shied away from using that name, instead referring to it simply as the normalization process. On the 13th of May 2021, in the aftermath of the Al-Aqsa Mosque conflict, the Biden administration was accused of being indifferent towards the violent conflict between Israeli statehood and the Palestinian minority there. Critics on both sides identified the reaction by the White House as lame and late. On the 21st of May 2021, a ceasefire was brokered between Israel and Hamas after 11 days of clashes. According to Biden, the U.S. will be playing a key role to rebuild damaged infrastructure in the Gaza alongside the Palestinian Authority. During a July 2022 visit to Israel, Biden stressed the importance of keeping the two-state vision alive. He met with Palestinian National Authority President Mahmoud Abbas and announced a new aid package to the Palestinians. During the administration of his predecessor Donald Trump, U.S. contributions to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees had been defunded. On the Israeli end, Prime Minister Yair Lapid reaffirmed his position on a two-state solution. On February 4, 2021, Biden issued a presidential memorandum for expanding protection of LGBT rights worldwide, which includes the possibility to impose financial sanctions. Despite Biden's low approvals, a red wave did not occur during the president's first midterm as many had anticipated. Democrats expanded their narrow Senate majority, while Republicans took control of the House of Representatives by a far smaller margin than expected. This was largely attributed to a backlash against the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, as well as the perceived extremeness of certain Republican candidates in competitive races. It was the first midterm election since 1986 in which the party of the incumbent president achieved a net gain in governorships, and the first since 1934 in which the president's party didn't lose any state legislative chambers or incumbent senators. Many pollsters and pundits had failed to predict the Democrats' resilient performance. Simon Rosenberg was one exception. Republican pollsters such as the Trafalgar Group had a notable polling miss, with errors far outside the margin of error in races such as the Senate races in Washington, Colorado, and New Hampshire. The results drew praise from the Democratic Party, and Biden celebrated the results as a strong day for democracy. Main articles: Joe Biden 2024 presidential campaign and 2024 United States presidential election. Further information: 2024 United States elections, 2024 Democratic Party presidential primaries, and 2024 Democratic National Convention. Biden's age and low approvals have led some to speculate that he may not run for re-election in 2024, though Biden has indicated his intent to run, with his final announcement expected by March 2023. Very early in Biden's presidency, opinion polls found that Biden's approval ratings were steadier than Trump's, with an average approval rating of 55% and an average disapproval rate of 39%. Biden's early approval ratings have been more polarized than Trump's, with 98% of Democrats, 61% of independents, and 11% of Republicans approving of Biden's presidency in February 2021, a party gap of 87%. Around the end of his first 100 days in office, Biden's approval rating was higher than Trump's but was the third worst since the presidency of Harry Truman. Only Trump and Gerald Ford scored lower. Following the fall of Kabul and the surge of COVID-19 cases due to the Delta variant in July and August 2021, Biden's approval rating began to steadily decline. From a high of 52.7% approval on July 26, 2021, to 45.9% approval by September 3, 2021, according to 538. While the White House emphasized COVID-19 as causing his low approval rating, inflation, the highest in nearly 40 years, has also been described as a cause. Biden's lowest approval rating on record comes from a Quinnipiac University poll in July 2022, which showed just 31% of respondents approving of his performance as president. By the one-year anniversary of Biden's presidency on January 20, 2022, Gallup recorded the average approval rating for Biden's first year as 49%, which was the second lowest first-year average approval rating for any American president since World War II. Only Trump's first-year average of 38.4% was lower. Gallup further noted that there was greater political polarization in Biden's approval ratings than any other first-year president in modern history, with 91% of Democrats supporting Biden while just 8% of Republicans supported him, resulting in a party gap of 83%. The only other year of any presidency that saw greater polarization was Trump's final year in office. The July 2022 Gallup survey saw Biden's sixth-quarter approval rating of 40%, the lowest sixth-quarter rating of any president in modern history dating back to Dwight Eisenhower. Thank you for watching.